The Weimar Republic died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide.
I'm Jessica Denson, host of Lights On with Jessica Denson, and it is my honor today to be joined by Timothy Ryback, a historian and author of Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. His work has surfaced very prominently recently in The Atlantic, not too long ago, in a piece called How Hitler Dismantled a Democracy in 53 Days. His new article in The Atlantic is called What the Press Got Wrong About Hitler. Journalists accurately reported that the Fuhrer was a little man whom the world was laughing at. It didn't matter. His historical perspective is invaluable. Such a pleasure to have you on Lights On. Welcome to Lights On.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Glad to be here.
So I kind of want to start with your piece, the theme of your earlier piece, How Hitler Dismantled a Democracy in 53 Days. I actually cited it a couple weeks ago when we had a massive rally on the National Mall. It happened to be, I could not believe it. I could not believe it. I kept checking my calendar. I said, is this really day 53? It was day 53 that we had this rally. And I was just thinking about the timing and how quickly things can erode when you're not paying attention, and how important it is in a moment when democracy is under attack to move quickly. Can you just kind of remind our viewers how quickly and what the process was like for Adolf Hitler to dismantle democracy in Germany in the 30s?
Well, it's rather astonishing. I'm a historian of German and Weimar in particular, Nazi era. But I think it may be almost singular in the history of democracies that someone set out to destroy democracy through democratic means. And, this was not, Mussolini, with his march on Rome. This is not, Franco taking over, establishing a fascist regime in Spain. This is a functioning constitutional democracy with a man announcing publicly that he will destroy democracy through democratic means, and set about very systematically doing that. And I think what is interesting, he was a committed fascist, but at the same time, Hitler and the people around him understood democratic processes as well as anyone else did, um, and knew exactly what to do to, first of all, disable and then dismantle, the democratic processes and structures ultimately.
Yeah, Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker wrote in his review of your book, he said, Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, an aggressively specific chronicle of a single year, 1932, seems a wise, even an inspired one. Ryback details week by week, day by day, and sometimes hour by hour how a country with a functional, if flawed democratic machinery handed absolute power over to someone who could never claim a majority in an actual election and whom the entire conservative political class regarded as a chaotic clown with a violent following. In a now familiar paradox, the rational forces stuck to magical thinking, while the irrational ones were more logical, parsing the brute equations of power. Tim, I'm so thinking every single day and wishing that the people in our situation right now with this hostile takeover that we are witnessing in the United States of America in 2025 would not stick to their magical thinking of thinking that we can, just wait till the next election or we can play by the rules, wanting them to use extreme legal measures, extreme constitutional measures to combat this. What lessons do you see in your study of Hitler and how he was able to accomplish this through, as you say, supposed, democratic means? What was the opposition doing or not doing to stop him?
Well, let me say three things here. And the first was Hitler, as I said, understood democratic processes better than anyone. You mentioned, as did Adam Gopnik, that Hitler never got a majority in any election. In the In the last completely free and open election, Hitler got only 33% of the vote. That's only a third of it. But and the best ever Hitler did in a completely open election was 37%. But listen to his logic. And this is where I said this man understood democratic processes as well as anyone. Hitler said 37% is 75% of 51%. So with that, he said, therefore, if I have the majority, the relative majority of a simple majority, I should have absolute power. Now, Hindenburg, the president, threw him out on his ear with that, would not appoint him chancellor. But what Hitler did with just over with that slight majority of the relative majority of the of 51%, he set about crushing or co-opting everyone on the right, meaning all of his possible competitors, not his opponents. And it's only after he had crushed all opposition among the other conservatives that he then turned to the left and systematically destroyed them. So it was a very thought out process. The second thing that he did that he really understood was, and this is the understanding the base, his political base. He only went after that 32%, 33% that he actually owned because he didn't care about anyone else. But there was a psychiatrist who actually attended a Hitler rally. He was not a Nazi, but he basically laid Hitler's collective following on the couch. And he said, when he's sitting there, he said Hitler's magic, this charisma that he had, did not lay in the logic. He said Hitler basically pounded on three basic themes. One was inflation, 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 unemployment, 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 and vengeance, vengeance, vengeance. We're going to, heads will roll, he said when he got in power. Um, but what actually it was his modulation, and this is what this psychiatrist realized. He watched the Hitler's effect, the way he would raise his voice to a crescendo and then stop and then suddenly come down, silence, and then continue. And it had a mesmerizing effect on his followers. And what Prinzhorn said, the psychiatrist, was he says, his opponents get him wrong because they think they keep calling him out on issues when it actually isn't the issues that really matter. It's the connection with this man. And so I think this made, in some ways, Hitler a very difficult opponent. The third piece, and this relates most specifically to your democracy, to the notion of democracy and what he did. Um, I'm not a political scientist, but my observation of at least Weimar Germany is that basically you had three lines of defense. The first is when you as an individual go to the voting booth, you cast your vote for one candidate or another. It's either the candidate you want or not. If it isn't the candidate you want, you've also voted for representatives who are in the case of Weimar, it was the Reichstag. In the case of America, it's Congress or the Senate. That's your second line of defense. The third are the institutions that are in place, the checks and balances system, and you have the executive, the legislative branch, and judiciary. Weimar Germany had the same thing. The great failure there was, and Hitler, when Hitler came to power, the first thing he wanted to do was to have an enabling act this is his first day in office. He said, I want to be dictator on day one. What happened was he found himself bumping up against all these constitutional guardrails. He was unable to ban other parties. He was unable to ban the press. There was one constraint after another. Um, but what he ultimately did was to begin, as I say, eliminating the competition, narrowing the field to the point where when he went before the legislature, the Reichstag, he needed a two-thirds majority vote at that time. There were a number of centrist parties. He owned with the right wing, he owned just under 50% or right around 50%, but he needed additional votes. Now, there was a conservative centrist group, and you heard the people going up, and they each had, before they cast their vote for their party, they had to state their reasons. And he said, you know, we're concerned about your attitude toward diversity in the society, your openness to others. We're concerned about rule of law. We're concerned about civil liberties. We're concerned about the future of democracy under your leadership. And yet, here is our vote. And you even hear laughter in the chamber because it's so absurd, but it really was you were watching a democratic society, a democratic body committing political suicide before your eyes. And so, and it was, but once again, it was a very sophisticated way that Hitler went about this, compromising people, coercing them, co-opting them to the point where he disabled completely the democratic system and in 53 days established himself as dictator.
There are really so many parallels, and I know you don't draw distinct direct lines, but we have to look no further than the language that Donald Trump uses, than the Nazi salutes that Elon Musk proudly displays at rallies and then tries to walk back or say we're something else. Donald Trump has a hallmark of his campaign has been xenophobia for years. He does very much engage in that carnival barker, showman, con artist show that is not rich in substance. It is a hypnosis. It is what you were describing that psychologist observed. It is the same thing that Fox News does with their audience. Repetition of simple taglines that basically has their audience in a trance and has them believing that this person is good for them when they are an extremely, extremely destructive force. But when you're thinking about the people that enabled him, the people that let him do this, can we fast forward to where a lot of these people ended up? If you can talk about some of the lawyers that helped Hitler navigate that democratic process. Where were they years later being hung, right, for their crimes against humanity? Can we fast forward in this scenario to all of the complicit actors and how ultimately they had to atone for the evil they had done?
Well, as you said, Hitler could not have done this alone. There were enablers. There were very smart lawyers who gave him the advice and the guidance for how to dismantle the democratic system. His key legal advisor was a man named Hans Frank, who ended up being hanged at Nuremberg for his complicity in Nazi atrocities. There were the bankers who financed Hitler basically because they were afraid of leftist political movements and how that might compromise business interests, and ended up financing Hitler. Industrialists as well. One of them, the most famous, was Fritz Thyssen of the Thyssen Industrial Group, who ended up in the Dachau concentration camp. Um, there was also the corporations, especially, I think most notably IG Farben, which in 1932 was committed to the Weimar Republic. Many Jewish executives and scientists, they had Nobel laureate scientists. They got on board with Hitler in 33 basically because of corporate interests. I mean, it was just you get in with the government, you get good contracts. Well, these contracts included by the early 1940s, providing Cyclone B cyanide gas that fueled the gas chambers at Auschwitz. And those executives ended up in court after the war for their complicity in these. So it's a dangerous train to get on. When you get off, it's almost impossible to get off, I assume. Jessica, can I add something else? You said something I think that was
Please.
really important that reminded me. When you mentioned Fox News and the media in general, there was a man named Alfred Hugenberg who was also one of these industrialists who supported Hitler, completely anti-democratic. But once again, one of these people who understood democracy as well as anyone. Hugenberg controlled a huge media group, 1,600 newspapers. They flooded the public space with fake news. They called them fabrications, but they were outright lies that made it into the pages of the newspapers. Outrageous things that the Berlin government, the national government in Berlin, was um, enslaving German teenagers and sending them to French colonies like Senegal or to the British colonies in order to pay work off service the German reparation payments. A complete absurdity, but you're reading this in the newspapers. But Hugen's point was not necessarily to promote a particular lie. What he realized was that a democracy needed consensus in the middle, and that what you could do, if you could get enough fake news out there, enough polarizing information, that you polarize societies. And with his newspapers, he was reaching towns, villages, the kitchen table of virtually every household in Germany. Um, and he said, if you can hollow out the center and polarize it, you can't, politicians can no longer reach across the aisle, and the democratic system will collapse of its own accord. And if one wants to look at resonances between then and now, I really see this with this polarization of political parties, with the polarization of the media landscape, with all of this, fake news or denial of truths is as dangerous as the lies themselves, but just this environment of complete chaos and with the center really falling away.
Yeah, I actually, when I was reading about him in your piece, what the press got wrong about Hitler, I was thinking Rupert Murdoch. I mean, he just reminded me so much of him. But I really want to focus on that piece for a minute because other than a character like him who was obviously pervading the space with fake news and trying very overtly, if you knew what he was doing, to divide the populace. On the flip side, you have the so-called pro-democracy space. We have this today. I could not help but be so incredibly reminded of some networks today, in particular, a network I used to work for, that makes a constant spectacle of Donald Trump. They're constantly ridiculing him. They're talking about his bodily functions. They're talking about his mistakes. He's falling, he's failing, he's losing his mind, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and you write about the way Hitler was treated this way by the press, constantly ridiculed, constantly written off, and told that he was just going to, seal his own demise. Um, and I was really, really just struck by the tone of your article and the detail that you go into of all of these examples of press who kind of followed this pattern, um, of how ineffective in the end it was.
Yeah,
And
and
please.
I mean, the reason I wrote that article was a single sentence that Hitler gave that I saw in one of his speeches. And this is right before he came to power. But he said, for 13 years, people have mocked and ridiculed me. No one is laughing now, which I just found incredibly chilling. But I do, we've watched over the last, 6 or 8 years, really humorous cartoons, all kinds of send-ups, all of this. Um, I do depends on where someone's political sentiments lie, but I don't see anybody laughing now. And I think what happened was it's, as you mentioned the term magical thinking. I think reporters were looking, and this has to do with the polarization, frankly. It has to do with, you know, journalists, instead of reporting the news, um, you know, feeding a certain ideology or a certain belief. And this has to do with this polarized media landscape. Just as you do today, you read in the new in the press of the Weimar period, um, you know, you read the Nazi press and you're getting Hitler's full speeches, you're getting all this adulation. You look at the liberal left wing, even centrist and left wing press, and you're getting, all of the, touching Hitler in all of these ridiculous moments. And there's one point where Hitler was literally caught with his pants down, and you see cartoons in the press with Hitler, standing there in his nightshirt with his, hairy legs sticking out and his hair disheveled. Um, Pretty funny. Um, but as Hitler himself said, nobody's laughing now.
Yeah, one of the things you write in that piece is he was well accustomed to overcoming mockery. It fueled his ambition. And I can tell you, our, loyal viewers here on Lights On know that 8 years ago, I was subjected to the hypnosis of Fox News and I was on the wrong side. And I woke up from that through very personal experience and coming clean and seeing the truth and understanding just what an up is down world I was living in. But I can tell you, when I was on that side, the mockery to me as a supporter of Donald Trump meant nothing. It didn't that was not part of my awakening at all. It was seeing for myself who this man really was and making connections through my own experience. The mockery I just wrote off, and actually it probably fuels the support of his supporters as much as it does of the man himself. It does not help anybody to break away.
And this goes back to that Hans Prinzhorn, that psychiatrist, who's really was frankly one of the most insightful essays I've ever read on Hitler as a man in the moment. And he just said, that there was this relationship to the debate. Actually, there's another piece I read. It was in Political last summer that really also reminded me of this. They said that, this was before, Trump was president, but this was talking about rallies, and it talked about the underestimated power of laughter. And they said Trump rallies are actually pretty funny if you go to them. As you said, opposition, newspapers and press are constantly calling him out on things. But actually, people who are at these rallies as political writer came, we said, these are actually pretty funny things. That it's mockery, it's deprecation against other individuals, but it's still pretty funny. When we think about a Hitler speech, we see Hitler at the height of power as the demagogue, with the Nuremberg rallies with tens of thousands of people standing there. But when you read the transcripts of Hitler's early beer hall speeches, you see repeatedly in there laughter, gales of laughter, storms of laughter, applause. And Hitler was actually a pretty funny guy in the beer hall, and you forget about that. But I do also think that has sort of it. I think it creates a sense of community among people, as you said, when the press is constantly assaulting him. I think the true believers just bracket that out of their lives, and the humor, this
Or it
inside
makes them
joke.
even more defensive of him.
It makes them more defensive of them, and the
Right.
humor is sort of becomes, the inside joke, and ultimately the joke is on the opposition, and uh,
Yeah.
sometimes, as in case of Germany, I mean, the joke turned into absolute tragedy.
Yeah. Well, the joke is on the opposition until, as we discussed a few minutes ago, the enablers are being hung at Nuremberg, right? So in the long run, I think there's so many lessons here. Obviously, my intention on this show, or maybe not obviously if you're a new viewer, but I don't even want to put on a show, Tim, if I don't have a lesson or a point of action or a call to action. And I really feel like your work is so instructive for us to be able to see both where we are failing right now and what we could be doing. I mean, I just think of from a press perspective, if all of the energy that is used to talk about Trump's foibles or, these kind of comical caricatures were used in the constitutional space right now, what could be legally done by the people in power to stop this dismantling of democracy that we're witnessing in 2025 in the United States of America? How about having some real conversations? How about talking about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? How about normalizing the constitutional means to remove this insane presidency, this illegal presidency from power? That's what I want us to return to. So I'm really so incredibly grateful for your perspective, for your scholarship. I want to put up the image of your book again. It's Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Before you leave us today, Tim, is there anything else, any other lesson you want to be seared in our memory from your study of Hitler?
I'll tell you, Jessica, yes, in closing, maybe, as I said, I don't draw lines from one historical figure to a contemporary. So I will say Adolf Hitler, Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler. The United States is not going to become the Fourth Reich. I do not believe there will be anything of the dimension of the Holocaust. But with that said, is there concern about democratic processes and structures? Yes, I think there is. Are there lessons to be learned from looking at the, the demise of the Weimar democracy? There was, and maybe in closing, there was a great scholar of this era who had actually survived Nazi Germany. And looking back, he said, the Weimar Republic died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide. We know who the perpetrator was, we know who killed it, but an act of political suicide by a democratic society is a collective action, and it takes the person at the voting booth, it takes our elected representatives in Congress, it takes the people inhabiting those institutions of the court and the executive branch to make sure that democracy survives and thrives. And is this a moment for concern? Yes, but I think we take lessons from the past and see where we go from there.
Yeah, well, one thing that a lot of us in this space, I'm so grateful to see the rising up of the people unwilling to engage in that act of democratic suicide. We, the people, are not standing for this in this moment. So thank you so much, Tim. Timothy Ryback, once again, author of Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Please check out his latest piece in The Atlantic, What the Press Got Wrong About Hitler. No, The Atlantic is not going out of business. Thank you so much for joining me today. Such a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Jessica.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us today on Lights On. Please subscribe to the Jessica Denson YouTube channel if you are not already. As always, this is the home for action. This is a movement. It is not a show. Thank you so much for being with us. And as always, let your light shine.